golden age in Pasic's political career. He and his party were now the dominant force in Serbian public life. Power suited this man who struggled so long to obtain it, and he quickly grew into the role of a father of his nation. Pasic was disliked by the Belgrade intellectual elite, but he enjoyed an immense preeminence among the peasantry. He spoke with a heavy, rustic dialect of Zašešar, found funny by people in Belgrade. His diction was halting, full of asides and interjections that lent themselves to anecdote. On being told that the famous satirical writer Branislav Nušić had protested against the annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908 by leading a demonstration through town and then riding his horse into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Pasic is said to have responded, You see, I knew he was good at writing books, but that he could ride so well, that I did not know. Pasic was a poor speaker, but an excellent communicator, especially to the peasants who formed the overwhelming majority of the Serbian electorate. In their eyes, Pasic's introverted, unsophisticated speech and slow-burning wit, not to mention his luxuriant patriarchal beard, were marks of an almost supernatural prudence, foresight, and wisdom. Among his friends and supporters, he went by the appellation Ba, a word that denotes a man of stature who is not only respected, but also loved by his contemporaries. A death sentence, long years of exile, the paranoia of a life under constant surveillance, all this left a deep imprint upon Pasic's practice and outlook as a politician. He acquired habits of caution, secrecy, and obliqueness. Many years later, a former secretary would recall that he tended not to commit ideas and decisions to paper or even indeed to the spoken word. He was in the habit of regularly burning his papers, both official and private. He developed a tendency to affect passivity in situations of potential conflict, a disinclination to show his hand until the last moment. He was pragmatic to the point where, in the eyes of his opponents, he seemed totally devoid of principle. All this was interwoven with an intense sensitivity to public opinion, a need to feel attuned to the Serb nation in whose cause he had suffered and worked. Pasic was informed of the regicide plot in advance and maintained its secrecy, but refused to be drawn into active involvement. When the details of the planned operation were passed to him the day before the assault on the palace, his very characteristic reaction was to take his family by train to the Adriatic coast, then under Austrian rule, and wait out the consequences. Pasic understood that his success would depend upon securing his own and the government's independence, while at the same time establishing a stable and durable relationship with the army and the regicide network within it. It was not simply a question of the 100-odd men who had actually taken part in the plot, but of the many younger officers, their numbers were steadily growing, who saw in the conspirators of the incarnation of a Serbian national will. The issue was complicated by the fact that Pasic's most formidable political opponents, the independent radicals, a breakaway faction that had split from his own party in 1901, were willing to collaborate with the regicides if it helped them to undermine the Pasic government. Pasic dealt intelligently with this delicate situation. He made personal overtures to individual conspirators with a view to disrupting the formation of an anti-government coalition. Despite protests from Radical Party colleagues, he backed a generous funding package for the army that made up some of the ground lost since the departure of King Father Milan. He publicly acknowledged the legitimacy of the coup of 1903, a matter of great symbolic importance to the conspirators, and opposed efforts to bring the regicides to trial. At the same time, however, he worked steadily towards curtailing their presence in public life. When it became known that the conspirators were planning to hold a celebratory dance on the first anniversary of the killings, Pasic, then foreign minister, intervened to have the festivity postponed to 15th June, the anniversary of the new king's election. During 1905, when the political influence of the regicides was a matter frequently raised in the press and parliament, Pasic warned the Skupština of the threat posed to the democratic order of non-responsible actors operating outside the structures of constitutional authority, a line that played well with the radical rank and file, who detested what they saw as the Praetorian spirit of the officer corps. In 1906, he skillfully exploited the issue of the renewal of normal relations with Great Britain in order to secure the pensioning off of a number of senior regicide officers. These deft maneuvers had an ambivalent effect. The most prominent regicides were removed from exposed positions, and the influence of their network on national politics was diminished in the short term. On the other hand, Pašić could do little to halt its growth within the army and among sympathetic civilians and the so-called Zevitelji, converts after the act to the cause of the conspiracy, who were prone to even more extreme views than the original accomplices. Most importantly of all, the removal of the most senior regicides from public life left the indefatigable Appy in a position of uncontested dominance within the network. Appy was always a central figure at anniversary celebrations of the regicide, at which officer conspirators met to drink beer and make merry in the Kolorak restaurant in a small park next to the National Theatre in central Belgrade, and he did more than any other conspirator to recruit a corps of ultra-nationalist officers prepared to support the struggle for the union of all Serbs by any available means. Mental maps. Underpinning the idea of the unification of all Serbs was a mental image of Serbia that bore little relation to the political map of the Balkans at the turn of the 20th century. Its most influential political expression was a secret memorandum drawn up by the Serbian Interior Minister Ilija Garašanin for killing Alexander Karađorđević in 1844. Known after its publication in 1906 as Naša Taninji, from the old Serbian Nashat draft, Garašanin's proposal sketched out a program for the national and foreign policy of Serbia. It would be difficult to overstate the influence of this document on generations of Serb politicians and patriots. In time, it became the Magna Carta of Serb nationalism. Garašanin opened his memorandum with the observation that Serbia is small but must not remain in this condition. The first commandment of Serbian policy, he argued, must be the principle of national unity, by which he meant the unification of all Serbs within the boundaries of a Serbian state. Where a Serb dwells, that is Serbia. The historical template for this expansive vision of Serbian statehood was the medieval empire of Stefan Dušan, a vast swathe of territory encompassing most of the present-day Serbian Republic, along with the entirety of present-day Albania, most of Macedonia, and all of central and northern Greece, but not Bosnia, interestingly enough. Tsar Dušan's empire collapsed after a defeat at the hands of the Turks on Kosovo Field, Kosovo Polje, on 28th of June 1389. But this setback, Garašanin argued, had not undermined the Serbian state's legitimacy. It had merely interrupted its historical existence. The restoration of a greater Serbia unifying all Serbs was thus no innovation, but the expression of an ancient historical right. They cannot accuse us of seeking something new, unfounded, of constituting a revolution or an upheaval, but rather everyone must acknowledge that this is politically necessary, that it was founded in very ancient times and has its roots in the former political and national life of the Serbs. Garašanin's argument thus exhibited the dramatic foreshortening of historical time that can sometimes be observed in the discourses of integral nationalism. It rested, moreover, upon the fiction that Tsar Dušan's sprawling multi-ethnic, composite, medieval polity could be conflated with the modern idea of a culturally and linguistically homogeneous nation-state. Serb patriots saw no inconsistency here, since they argued that virtually all the inhabitants of these lands were essentially Serbs. Vuk Karadžić, the architect of the modern Serbo-Croat literary language and author of a famous nationalist tract, Shrib Svi Izvuda, Serbs All and Everywhere, published in 1836, spoke of a nation of 5 million Serbs creating the Serbian language and scattered from Bosnia and Herzegovina to the Banat of Temișvar, eastern Hungary, now in western Romania, the Bačka, a region extending from northern Serbia into southern Hungary, Croatia, Dalmatia, and the Adriatic coast from Trieste to northern Albania. And of course, there were some in these lands, Karadzic conceded he was referring in particular to the Croats, who still find it difficult to call themselves Serbs, but it seems likely that they will gradually become used to it. The unification program committed the Serbian polity, as Garašanin knew, to a long struggle with the two great land empires, the Ottoman and the Austrian, whose dominions encroached on the greater Serbia of the nationalist imagination. In 1844, the Ottoman Empire still controlled most of the Balkan Peninsula, Serbia must constantly strive to break stone after stone out of the facade of the Turkish state and absorb them into itself, so that it can use this good material on the good old foundations of the Serbian Empire to build and establish a great new Serbian state. Austria, too, was destined to be a foe. In Hungary, Croatia, Slavonia, and Istria-Dalmatia, there were Serbs, not to mention many Croats, who had not yet embraced Serbdom, supposedly awaiting liberation from Habsburg rule and unification under the umbrella of the Belgrade state. Until 1918, when many of its objectives were met, Garashinin's memorandum remained the key policy blueprint for Serbia's rulers, while its precepts were broadcast to the population at large through a drip feed of nationalist propaganda, partly coordinated from Belgrade and partly driven by patriot networks within the press. The greater Serbian vision was not just a question of government policy, however, or even of propaganda. It was woven deeply into the culture and identity of the Serbs. The memory of Dušan's great empire resonated within the extraordinarily vivid tradition of Serbian popular epic songs. These were long ballads, often sung to the melancholy accompaniment of the one-stringed guzla, in which singers and listeners relived great archetypal moments of Serbian history. In villages and markets across the Serbian lands, these songs established a remarkably intimate linkage between poetry, history, and identity. An early observer of this was the German historian Leopold von Ranke, who noted in his History of Serbia, published in 1829, that the history of the nation developed by its poetry has, through it, been converted into a national property and is thus preserved in the memory of the people. What was preserved above all within this tradition was the memory of the Serbian struggle against the alien rule. A recurring preoccupation was the defeat of the Serbs at the hands of the Turks at Kosovo Field on 28th of June, 1389. Embroidered over the centuries, this rather indecisive medieval battle burgeoned into a symbolic set-piece between Serbdom and its infidel foe. Around it twined a chronicle peopled not only by shining heroes who had united the Serbs in their time of trouble, but also by treacherous villains who had withheld their support from the common cause, or had betrayed the Serbs to their enemies. The mythical pantheon included the celebrated assassin Miloš Obljević, of whom the songs tell that he infiltrated Turkish headquarters on the day of the battle and cut the Sultan's throat before being captured and beheaded by Ottoman guards. Assassination, martyrdom, victimhood, and the thirst for revenge on behalf of the dead were central themes. An imagined Serbia, projected onto a mythical past, came to a brilliant life within this song culture. Observing performances of epic songs among the Bosnian Serbs during the anti-Turkish uprising of 1875, the British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans marvelled at their capacity to make the Bosnian Serb forget the narrower traditions of his kingdom in these more glorious legends, to merge his experience with that of his brothers in all Serbian lands and thereby override the cant of geographers and diplomatists. It is true that this culture of oral epic entered an era of gradual decline in the 19th century as it began to be displaced by popular print. But the British diplomat Sir Charles Eliot heard the epics performed by travelling players at markets in the valley of the River Drina when he made a journey through Serbia in 1897. These rhapsodies, he noted, are sung in a monotonous chant to the accompaniment of a single-strained guitar, but with such genuine feeling and expression that the whole effect is not unpleasing. In any case, the immensely influential printed collections of Serbian epic poetry compiled and published by Vuk Karadžić ensured that they remained in circulation among the growing literary elite. Moreover, the epic corpus continued to grow. The Mountain Wreath, a classic of the genre, published in 1847 by the Prince Bishop of Montenegro, Petar II Petrović Njegos, glorified the mythical tyrant slayer and national martyr Miloš Obljević and called for the renewal of the struggle against alien rule. The Mountain Wreath entered the Serb national canon and has stayed there ever since. The commitment to the redemption of lost Serbian lands, coupled with the predicaments of an exposed location between two land empires, endowed the foreign policy of the Serbian state with a number of salient features. The first of these was an indeterminacy of geographical focus. The commitment in principle to a greater Serbia was one thing, but where exactly should the process of redemption begin? in Vojvodina within the Kingdom of Hungary, in Ottoman Kosovo known as Old Serbia, in Bosnia, which had never been part of Dušan's empire but contained a substantial population of Serbs, or in Macedonia to the south, still under Ottoman rule. The mismatch between the visionary objective of unification and the meager financial and military resources available to the Serbian state meant that Belgrade policymakers had no choice but to respond opportunistically to rapidly changing conditions of the Balkan Peninsula. As a result, the orientation of Serbian foreign policy between 1844 and 1914 swung like a compass needle from one point on the state's periphery to another. The logic of these oscillations was as often as not reactive. In 1848, when Serbs in the Vojvodina rose up against the Magyarizing policies of the Hungarian revolutionary government, Garashinin assisted them with supplies and volunteer forces from the Principality of Serbia. In 1875, all eyes were on Herzegovina, where the Serbs had risen in revolt against the Ottomans. Among those who rushed to the scene of that struggle were Pasic and the military commander and future king Petar Karađorđević, who fought there under an alias. After 1903, following an abortive local uprising against the Turks, there was an intensified interest in liberating the Serbs of Ottoman Macedonia. In 1908, when the Austrians formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, having held them under military occupation since 1878, the occupied areas shot to the top of the agenda. In 1912 and 1913, however, Macedonia was once again the first priority. Serbian foreign policy had to struggle with the discrepancy between the visionary nationalism that suffused the country's political culture and the complex ethnic realities of the Balkans. Kosovo was at the center of the Serbian mythscape, but it was not, in ethnic terms, an unequivocally Serbian territory. Muslim Albanian speakers had been in the majority there since at least the 18th century. Many of the Serbs Vuk Karadžić counted in Dalmatia and Istria were in fact Croats, who had no wish to join a greater Serbian state. Bosnia, which had historically never been part of Serbia, contained many Serbs. They constituted 43% of the population of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1878, when the two provinces were occupied by Austria-Hungary. But it also contained Catholic Croats, about 20%, and Bosnian Muslims, about 33%. The survival of a substantial Muslim minority was one of the distinctive features of Bosnia. In Serbia itself, the Muslim communities had for the most part been harassed into emigration, deported, or killed during the long struggle for independence. Even more complicated was the case of Macedonia. Superimposed onto a present-day political map of the Balkans, the geographical region known as Macedonia encompasses, in addition to the former Yugoslav Republic of the same name, border areas along the southern Serbian and eastern Albanian periphery, a large chunk of southwestern Bulgaria, and a huge swathe of northern Greece. The precise historical boundaries of Macedonia remain controversial today. Witness the still smouldering conflict between Athens and Skopje over the use of the name Macedonia for the Skopje Republic, as does the question of whether and to what extent this region possessed a distinctive cultural, linguistic, or national identity. To this day, the existence of Macedonian language is acknowledged by linguists everywhere in the world except Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece. In 1897, when Sir Charles Eliot travelled through Serbia, he was surprised to find that his Serbian companions would not allow that there were any Bulgarians in Macedonia, but rather insisted that the Slavonic inhabitants of that country were all Serbs. 16 years later, when the Carnegie Foundation dispatched a commission to the area to investigate atrocities committed in the course of the Second Balkan War, they found it impossible to establish consensus on the ethnicity of the people living in Macedonia. So polarized was the atmosphere in which these issues were discussed, even at the university. The report the commission published in that year included not one but two ethnic maps of the region, reflecting the view from Belgrade and the view from Sofia respectively. In one, western and northern Macedonia pullated with unliberated Serbs awaiting unification with their motherland. In the other, the region appeared as the heartland of the Bulgarian zone of settlement. During the last decades of the 19th century, the Serbs, the Greeks, and the Bulgarians all ran highly active propaganda agencies inside Macedonia, whose purpose was to proselytize the local Slavs to their respective national causes. The mismatch between national visions and ethnic realities made it highly likely that the realization of Serbian objectives would be a violent process, not only at the regional level, where the interests of greater and lesser powers were engaged, but also in the towns and villages of the contested areas. Some statesmen met this challenge by trying to package Serbian national objectives within a more generous Serbo-Croat political vision, encompassing the idea of multi-ethnic collaboration. Among them was Nikola Pasic, who wrote at length in the 1890s about the need for Serbs and Croats to unite in a world where small nations were bound to go under. Underlying this rhetoric, however, were the assumptions, first, that Serbs and Croats were in essence the same people, and second, that the Serbs would have to lead this process because they were a more authentically Slavic people than the Catholic Croats, who had so long been exposed to the influence of foreign culture. As a small and relatively poorly resourced state on the frontier between two land empires, Serbia could ill afford to pursue its objectives before the eyes of the world. A degree of clandestinity was thus pre-programmed in the pursuit of liberty for Serbs who were still the subjects of neighbouring states or empires. Garashinin articulated this imperative in 1848 during the uprising in Vojvodina. The Vojvodina Serbs, he wrote, expect from all Serbdom a helping hand so they can triumph over their traditional enemy. But because of political factors, we cannot aid publicly. It only remains for us to aid them in secret. This preference for covert operations can also be observed in Macedonia. Following an abortive Macedonian insurrection against the Turks in August 1903, the new Karađorđević regime began to operate in active policy in the region. Committees were established to promote Serb guerrilla activity in Macedonia, and there were meetings in Belgrade to recruit and supply bands of fighters. Confronted by the Ottoman minister in Belgrade, the Serbian foreign minister Kaljević denied any involvement by the government and protested that the meetings were in any case not illegal, since they had been convened not for the raising of bands, but merely for collecting funds and expressing sympathy for co-religionists beyond the border. The regicides were deeply involved in this cross-border activity. The conspirator officers and their fellow travellers within the army convened an informal national committee in Belgrade, coordinated the campaign and commanded many of the volunteer units. These were not, strictly speaking, units of the Serbian army proper, but the fact that volunteer officers were immediately granted leave by the army suggested a generous measure of official backing. Militia activity steadily expanded in scope, and there were numerous violent skirmishes between Serb, Chetniks, guerrillas, and bands of Bulgarian volunteers. In February 1907, the British government requested that Belgrade put a stop to this activity, which appeared likely to trigger a war between Serbia and Bulgaria. Once again, Belgrade disclaimed responsibility, denying that it was funding Chetnik activity and declaring that it could not prevent its people from defending themselves against foreign bands. But the plausibility of this posture was undermined by the government's continuing support for the struggle. In November 1906, Skupština had already voted 300,000 dinars for aid to Serbs suffering in Old Serbia and Macedonia, and this was followed by a secret credit for extraordinary expenses and the defence of national interests. Irredentism of this kind was fraught with risk. It was easy to send guerrilla chiefs into the field, but difficult to control them once they were there. By the winter of 1907, it was clear that a number of the Chetnik bands were operating in Macedonia independently of any supervision. Only with some difficulty did an emissary from Belgrade succeed in reimposing control. The Macedonian imbroglio thus delivered an equivocal lesson with fateful implications for the events of 1914. On the one hand, the devolution of command functions to activist cells dominated by members of the conspirator network carried the danger that control over Serb national policy might pass from the political centre to irresponsible elements on the periphery. On the other hand, the diplomacy of 1906-07 demonstrated that the fuzzy, informal relationship between the Serbian government and the networks entrusted with delivering irredentist policy could be exploited to deflect political responsibility from Belgrade and maximize the government's room for maneuver. The Belgrade political elite became accustomed to a kind of double-think founded on the intermittent pretense that the foreign policy of official Serbia and the work of national liberation beyond the frontiers of the state were separate phenomena. Separation. Agreement and harmony with Austria are a political impossibility for Serbia, wrote Garashinin in 1844. Until 1903, the potential for open conflict between Belgrade and Vienna was limited. The two countries shared a long frontier that was, from Belgrade's perspective, more or less indefensible. The Serbian capital, handsomely situated on the confluence of the rivers Danube and Sava, was only a short drive from the border with Austria-Hungary. Serbian exports went mainly to the empire, and a large proportion of its imports were sourced there. The imperatives of geography were reinforced by Russia's policy in the region. At the Congress of Berlin in 1878, Russia had helped to carve a large Bulgarian entity out of Ottoman Empire, in the expectation that Bulgaria would remain a Russian client. Since it was foreseeable that Bulgaria and Serbia would one day be rivals for territory in Macedonia, Prince, later King, Milan, sought to balance this threat by seeking a closer relationship with Vienna. Russia's support for Sofia thus pushed Serbia into the arms of Vienna. As long as Russia continued to play its Balkan policy with Bulgarian cards, relations between Vienna and Belgrade were likely to remain harmonious. In June 1881, Austria-Hungary and Serbia agreed a commercial treaty. 3 weeks later, it was supplemented by a secret convention negotiated and signed by Prince Milan himself, which stipulated that Austria-Hungary would not only assist Serbia in its efforts to secure elevation to the status of a kingdom, but would also support Serbian claims to territorial annexations in Macedonia. Serbia, for its part, agreed not to undermine the monarchy's position in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Article 2 stated that Serbia would not permit any political, religious, or other intrigue to be directed from her territory against the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, including Bosnia, Herzegovina, and the Sanjak of Novi Pazar. Milan reinforced these agreements with a personal engagement in writing not to enter into any kind of treaty with the third state without first consulting Vienna. These agreements were, to be sure, a fragile foundation for good Austro-Serbian relations. They had no anchorage in the sentimental life of the Serbian public, which was deeply anti-Austrian. They symbolized a relationship of economic dependency which was increasingly unacceptable to Serbian nationalist opinion, and they depended on the cooperation of an erratic and increasingly unpopular Serbian monarch. But as long as Milan Obrenović remained on the throne, they at least ensured that Serbia would not side with Russia against Austria, and that the sharp end of Belgrade's foreign policy would stay pointed in the direction of Macedonia and the coming contest with Bulgaria, rather than at Bosnia and Herzegovina. A new trade treaty was signed in 1892, and the secret convention was renewed for 10 years in 1889. It was allowed to expire thereafter, though it continued to be the operative platform for the Serbian policy vis-à-vis Vienna. The change of dynasty in 1903 signaled a major realignment. Austria was quick to recognize Karađorđević's coup, partly because Petar had assured the Austrians beforehand that it was his intention to keep Serbia on an Austrophile course. But it was soon evident that Serbia's new leaders planned to push towards greater economic and political independence. During 1905-06, a crisis unfolded in which trade policy, armaments orders, high finance, and geopolitics were closely intertwined. Vienna pursued a threefold objective: to secure a commercial treaty with Serbia, to ensure that Serbian armaments orders would continue to be placed with Austrian firms, and to contract a major loan to Belgrade. The failure to achieve agreement on any of these questions produced a drastic cooling of relations between the two neighbors, and the outcome was an unmitigated disaster for Vienna. The Serbian armaments orders went to the French firm Schneider Kreutzwert instead of to the Austrian rival, Škoda of Bohemia. The Austrians reacted by closing the border to Serbian pork, triggering a customs conflict that came to be known as the Pig War, 1906-09. But this was a counterproductive measure, since Serbia quickly found other export markets, especially in Germany, France, and Belgium, and at last began to build slaughterhouses on a substantial scale, thus emancipating itself from its long-standing dependence on Austro-Hungarian processing facilities. Finally, Belgrade secured a major loan again, not from Vienna, but from Paris, offered in return for the placement of armament orders with French firms. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider the larger significance of this French loan. Like all the emergent Balkan states, Serbia was an inveterate borrower, totally dependent on international credit, most of which was used to finance military expansion and infrastructural projects. Throughout the reign of King Milan, the Austrians remained willing lenders to Belgrade. But since these loans outran the debtor state's financial resources, they had to be hypothecated against various pledges. For each loan, some definite revenue was pledged, or some railway property mortgaged. It was agreed that pledged revenues from railways, stamp, and liquor taxes should be paid into a special treasury controlled jointly by the representatives of the Serbian government and the bondholders. This arrangement kept the Serbian state afloat during the 1880s and 90s, but did nothing to restrain the financial profligacy of the Belgrade government, which had managed to accumulate an indebtedness of over 350 million francs by 1895. With bankruptcy looming, Belgrade negotiated a new loan through which almost all of the old debts were consolidated at a lower rate of interest. The pledged revenues were placed under a separate administration run partly by the representatives of the creditors. In other words, fragile debtors like Serbia, the same applied to the other Balkan states and to the Ottoman Empire, could secure loans on reasonable terms only if they agreed to concessions of fiscal control that amounted to the partial hypothecation of sovereign state functions. For this reason, among others, international loans were in this era a political issue of the highest importance, inextricably wound up with diplomacy and power politics. French international lending in particular was highly politicized. Paris vetoed loans to governments whose policies were deemed unfriendly to French interests. It facilitated loans in return for economic or political concessions. On occasion, it reluctantly conceded a loan to unreliable but strategically important clients in order to prevent them from seeking relief elsewhere. It pursued potential clients aggressively. In Serbia's case, the government were given to understand in the summer of 1905 that if they did not give France first refusal on the loan, the Paris money markets would be closed altogether to Serbia. Recognizing this nexus between strategy and finance, the French Foreign Ministry merged its commercial and political divisions in 1907. Seen against this background, the Serbian loan of 1906 was an important turning point. French financial relations with Belgrade became, in the words of an early American analyst of pre-war high finance, more intimate and dominant. The French came to own more than 3/4 of all Serbian debt. These were vast commitments for the Serbian state. Repayment schedules were extended forwards to 1967. In fact, Belgrade defaulted on the greater part of its obligations after 1918. The lion's share of this money went into military purchases, especially fast-firing artillery, most of which were transacted in France, much to the annoyance not just of Austrian but also of British diplomats and armaments suppliers. The loan of 1906 also enabled Serbia to resist Vienna's commercial pressure and to wage a protracted tariff war. The undoubtedly successful issue of Mr. Pasha's resistance to Austrian demands, the British envoy in Belgrade reported in 1906, marks a distinct step in the economic and political emancipation of Serbia. These successes in the field of high finance should not distract us from the parlous condition of the Serbian economy as a whole. This had much less to do with Austrian tariff policy than with a process of economic decline that was deeply rooted in the country's history and agrarian structure. The emergence and subsequent expansion of Serbia were accompanied by a process of drastic de-urbanization as the mainly Muslim towns were depopulated through decades of harassment and deportations. What replaced the relatively urbanized and cosmopolitan imperial structures of the Ottoman periphery was a society and an economy entirely dominated by smallholding Christian peasants, a consequence in part of the absence of a homegrown Serbian aristocracy, and in part of the ruling dynasty's efforts to prevent the emergence of such a ruling class by blocking the consolidation of latifundial estates. While the city shrank, the population grew at an awesome rate. Hundreds of thousands of hectares of marginal land were opened up for exploitation by young families, loosening social constraints on marriage and fertility. But this rampant growth in the production of people did nothing to reverse the cycle of underperformance and decline that gripped the Serbian economy from the middle of the 19th century and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Per capita output in farming fell by 27.5% between the early 1870s and 1910-12, partly because the expansion of arable land led to a large-scale deforestation and thus to a decline in the pasture lands needed to sustain large-scale pig husbandry, traditionally the most profitable and efficient arm of Serbian agricultural production. By the 1880s, the beautiful forested wildernesses of Šumadija, perfect pasture land for the swine, had all but disappeared. This record might have mattered less if there had been marked growth in the commercial and industrial sectors, but here too the picture was bleak, even by Balkan standards. Enterprise culture in Serbia generated little in the way of demand for domestically produced manufactured goods. The rural population had poor access to markets, and there was not much in the way of starter industries, such as the textile mills that helped to drive industrial growth in neighboring Bulgaria. Under these conditions, Serbian economic development depended upon inward investment. The first effort to pack and export plum jam on an industrial basis was launched by employees of a Budapest fruit processing company. The silk and wine booms of the late 19th century were likewise triggered by foreign entrepreneurs. But inward investment remained sluggish, in part because foreign firms were put off by the xenophobia, corrupt officials, and underdeveloped business ethics that they encountered when they attempted to set up operations in Serbia. Even in areas where it was government policy to encourage investment, the harassment of foreign businesses by local authorities remained a serious problem. Investment in Serbia's human capital was just as unimpressive. In 1900, there were still only 4 teaching colleges for all Serbia. Half of all elementary school teachers had no pedagogical training. Most school classes were not held in buildings designed for the purpose, and only around 1/3 of children actually attended school. All these shortcomings reflected the cultural preferences of a rural population that cared little for education and saw schools as alien institutions imposed by the government. In 1905, pressed to ratify a new revenue source, the peasant-dominated assembly of the Skupština chose to tax school books rather than home distillation. The result was a strikingly low rate of literacy, ranging from 27% in the northern districts of the kingdom to only 12% in the southeast. This grim landscape of growth without development bears on our story in a number of ways. It meant that Serbian society remained unusually homogeneous, both in socio-economic and cultural terms. The bond between urban life and the folkways of peasant oral culture, with its powerful mythical narratives, was never severed. Even Belgrade, where the literacy rate in 1900 was only 21%, remained a city of rural immigrants, a world of peasant urbanites deeply influenced by the culture and kinship structures of traditional rural society. In this environment, the development of modern consciousness was experienced not as an evolution from a previous way of understanding the world, but rather as a dissonant overlaying of modern attitudes onto a way of being that was still enchanted by traditional beliefs and values. This highly distinctive economic and cultural conjecture helps to explain several salient features of pre-war Serbia. In an economy so lacking in opportunities for ambitious and talented young men, the army was the biggest show in town. And this in turn helps to account for the fragility of the civilian authorities in the face of challenges from the military command structure, a crucial factor in the crisis that engulfed Serbia in the summer of 1914. However, it was also true that the partisan warfare of irregular militias and guerrilla bands, which was such a central theme in the story of Serbia's emergence as an independent nation, owed its durability to the persistence of a peasant culture that remained wary of the regular army. For a government confronted with an increasingly arrogant military culture and lacking the organic connection with a large and prosperous educated class that underpinned other 19th century parliamentary systems, nationalism represented the single most potent political instrument and cultural force. The almost universal enthusiasm for the annexation of yet unredeemed Serb lands drew not only on the mythical passions embedded in popular culture, but also on the land hunger of a peasantry whose plots were growing smaller and less productive. Under these conditions, the argument, however dubious, that Serbia's economic woes were the fault of Vienna's punitive tariffs and the stranglehold of Austrian and Hungarian capital could not fail to meet with the most enthusiastic approbation. These constraints also fed Belgrade's obsession with securing an outlet to the sea that would supposedly enable it to break out of backwardness. The relative weakness of commercial and industrial development ensured that Serbia's rulers remained dependent upon international finance for the military expenditures that they required in order to pursue an active foreign policy. And this, in turn, helps to explain the deepening integration of Serbia into France's web of alliances after 1905, which was rooted in both financial and geopolitical imperatives. Escalation. After 1903, the attention of Serbian nationalists was focused mainly on the three-way struggle between Serbs, Bulgarians, and Turks, unfolding in Macedonia. All this changed in 1908 with the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina by Austria-Hungary. Since these two formerly Ottoman provinces had been under Austrian occupation for 30 years, and there had never been any question of an alteration of this arrangement, it might seem that the nominal change from occupation to outright annexation ought to have been a matter of indifference. The Serbian public took a different view. The announcement created an unparalleled outburst of resentment and national enthusiasm, both in Belgrade and in the provinces. There were many meetings at which speakers clamored for war against Austria. More than 20,000 people attended an anti-Austrian rally at the National Theatre in Belgrade, where Ljubija Davidović, leader of the independent radicals, gave a speech declaring that Serbians must fight the annexation to the death. "We will struggle until we are victorious, but if we are defeated, we will be defeated knowing that we gave our greatest effort and that we have the respect not only for all Serbs, but also for the whole Slavic race." A few days later, the impetuous crown priest, Prince Georgi, delivered a speech before an audience of about 10,000 in the capital city, in which he proposed to lead the Serbian people in an armed crusade to retrieve the annexed provinces. "I am extremely proud to be a soldier, and I would be proud to be one of those who leads you, the Serbian people, in this desperate struggle for life and death, for our nation and our honor." Even Nikola Pasic, president of the Serbian Radical Party, who was at this time not a serving minister and thus freer to speak his mind, argued that if annexation could not be reversed, Serbia must prepare for a war of liberation. The Russian liberal Pavel Milyukov, who visited Serbia in 1908, was shocked by the intensity of the public emotion. The anticipation of war with Austria, he recalled, became a readiness to fight, and a victory seemed both easy and certain. These views were universal and so unquestioned that to get into an argument over them would have been totally useless. The mental maps that informed elite and popular understandings of Serbia's policy and purpose were once again in evidence. The only way to understand the intensity of feeling aroused in Serbia by the annexation, the British minister in Belgrade explained in a report of 27th of April 1909, was to recall that every patriotic Serbian who takes any interest or active part in politics thinks of the Serbian nation not as merely including the subjects of King Peter, but as consisting of all those who are akin to them in race and language. He looks forward, consequently, to the eventual creation of a greater Serbia, which shall bring into one fold all the different sections of the nation, at present divided under Austrian, Hungarian, and Turkish dominion. From his point of view, Bosnia is both geographically and ethnographically the heart of Great Serbia. In an almost contemporary tract on the crisis, the celebrated ethnographer Jovan Cvic, Nikola Pasic's most influential advisor on the nationality question, observed that it was plain that Bosnia and Herzegovina, by their central position in the ethnographical mass of the Serbo-Croat race, hold the key to the Serb problem. Without them, there can be no great Serb state. From the perspective of pan-Serb publicists, Bosnia-Herzegovina belonged to the Serb lands under foreign domination. Its population was entirely Serbian in race and language, consisting of Serbs, Serbo-Croats, and Serb Mohammedans, except, of course, for the minority of temporary inhabitants and exploiters installed by the Austrians over the previous 30 years. Powered by this wave of outrage, a new mass organization sprang up to pursue nationalist objectives. Known as the Serbian National Defense, Srpska Narodna Odbrana, It recruited thousands of members dispersed across more than 220 committees in towns and villages of Serbia, and a network of auxiliaries within Bosnia and Herzegovina. The irredentist campaign that had been gaining momentum in Macedonia was now directed at the annexed provinces. Narodna Odobrana organized guerrilla bands, recruited volunteers, established espionage networks within Bosnia, and lobbied the government for a more aggressive national policy. Veterans from the fighting in Macedonia, such as Major Voja Sankosic, a close associate of Api, were deployed to the Bosnian frontier where they trained thousands of new recruits for the coming struggle. It looked for a time as if Serbia was on the point of launching a suicidal assault on its neighbors. The leaders in Belgrade at first encouraged the agitation, but they were also quick to see that Serbia stood no chance of reversing the annexation. The key to this sobering of the mood was Russia, which did little to encourage Serbian resistance. This was hardly surprising, since it was the Russian Foreign Minister Alexander Ivolsky who had proposed the annexation, in principle at least, to his Austrian counterpart Alois Aehrenthal. Izvolsky had even warned the Serbian Foreign Minister Milan Milanovic in advance of the impending annexation. At a meeting at Marienbad, where Izvolsky was taking the waters, the Russian Foreign Minister had informed his Serbian counterpart that although St. Petersburg considered the Balkan states to be children of Russia, neither Russia herself nor any of the other great powers would do anything to contest the annexation. Izvolsky omitted to mention to his Serbian interlocutor that the fact that he himself had proposed the annexation of the provinces to the Austrian as part of a deal to secure better access for Russian warships to the Turkish Straits. The Serbian minister in St. Petersburg was later warned that Belgrade should under no circumstances mobilize against Austria because no one would be able to help us. The whole world wants peace. Foreign Minister Milanovic, a moderate politician who had been critical of Pasic's handling of the Austro-Serbian crisis of 1905-06 and was shocked to find him advocating war in 1908, was placed in an extremely delicate position. Having conferred directly with Izvolsky, he could see that there was no mileage in the idea of rallying the European powers against the annexation. But he had also had to rein in the nationalist hysteria in Serbia, while at the same time unifying the Skupština and the political elite behind a moderate national policy, two objectives that were virtually irreconcilable, since the Serbian public would construe any hint of a concession to Vienna's standpoint as a betrayal of the national interest. His difficulties were compounded by the hostility between the radicals and their former party comrades, the independent radicals, whose policies were marked by an uncompromising brand of pan-Serb nationalism. Factional rivalries within the radical leadership, such as that between the Pasic group and the court radicals around the Milanovic, deepened the confusion and uncertainty. Behind the scenes, Milanovic worked hard to pursue a moderate policy focused on securing limited territorial compensation for Serbia, and endured without complaint the vilification of the pan-Serb press. In public, however, he adopted an intransigent rhetoric bound to rouse enthusiasm at home and provoke outrage in the Austrian newspapers. The Serbian national program, he announced to rapturous applause in a speech before the Skupština in October 1908, demands that Bosnia and Herzegovina be emancipated. By interfering with the realization of this plan, he declared Austria-Hungary had made it inevitable that one day, in the near or distant future, Serbia and all of Serbdom will fight it in a struggle for life or death. Milovanovic's predicament illuminates the stresses to which Serbian policymakers were exposed in this era. This intelligent and cautious man understood very clearly the limitations imposed by Serbia's location and condition. In the winter of 1908 and 9, all the powers urged Belgrade to step down and accept the inevitable. But he also knew that no responsible minister could afford openly to disavow the national program of Serbian unification. And, in any case, Milanovic was himself a fervent and sincere proponent of that program. Serbia, he had once said, could never afford to abandon the cause of Serbdom. From a Serbian standpoint, there is no difference between Serbian state interests and interests of other Serbs. Here again were the projections of the Serbian mental map. on which political and ethnic imperatives were merged. The crucial point was this: moderates like Milanovic, and even Pasic, who eventually climbed down from his calls for war, differed fundamentally from the extreme nationalists only on the matter of how to manage the predicaments of facing the state. They could not afford and did not wish to disavow the nationalist program as such. Domestically, then, the extremists were always at a rhetorical advantage, since it was they who set the terms of the debate. In such an environment, moderates would find it difficult to make themselves heard unless they adopted the language of the extremists, and this in turn made it difficult for external observers to discern any variation in the positions adopted across the political elite, which could deceptively appear to form a solid front of unanimity. The dangerous dynamics of this political culture would haunt Belgrade in June and July 1914. In the event, Austria-Hungary, of course, prevailed, and Belgrade was forced formally to renounce its claims on the 31st March 1909. With great difficulty, the government managed to calm the agitation. Belgrade promised Vienna that it would disarm and break up its volunteers and bands. Srpska Narodna Odbrana was divested of its insurrectionary and war-waging functions and transformed, outwardly at least, into a peaceful pan-Serbian propaganda and information agency operating in close association with a range of other nationalist associations, such as the Soko Gymnastic Society and groups like Prosveta and Prirednik, whose task was to reinforce Serbian cultural identity through literature, public education, and youth work. Serbia may have failed to reverse the annexation or secure the territorial concessions that Milanovic had demanded as compensation, but there were two important changes. First, the crisis inaugurated a period of closer collaboration between Belgrade and the two friendly great powers. The link to St. Petersburg was strengthened by the arrival of the new Russian minister, Baron Nikolai Hartwig, a vehement pan-Slav and Serbophile who would play a central role in Belgrade political life until his sudden death just before the outbreak of war in 1914. The financial and political ties to France were also reinforced, manifested in a huge loan brokered by Paris for the purpose of expanding the Serbian army and improving its striking power. Secondly, the rage and disappointment of 1908-9 had a radicalizing effect on the nationalist groups. Though they were temporarily demoralized by the government's capitulation on the annexation question, they did not renounce their ambitions. A gulf opened up between the government and the nationalist milieu. Bogdan Radenkovic, a civilian national activist in Macedonia, where the struggle against the Bulgarians continued, met with officer veterans of the Macedonian Front, some of them conspirators of 1903, to discuss the creation of a new secret entity. The result was the formation on the 3rd of March 1911 in a Belgrade apartment of Udenezhny ili Smrt, Union or Death, popularly known as the Black Hand. Appy, now professor of tactics at the military academy, was among the 7 men, 5 officer regicides and 2 civilians, present at that founding meeting. He brought with him the network of younger regicides and fellow travellers over which he now exercised unchallenged leadership. The constitution of Udenezhny ili Smrt opened with the unsurprising declaration that the aim of the new association was the unification of Serbdom. Further articles stated that the members must strive to influence the government to adopt the idea that Serbia was the Piedmont of the Serbs, and, indeed, all of the South Slavs people. The journal founded to expound the ideals of Udenezhny ili Smrt duly bore the title Piedmont. The new movement assumed an encompassing, hegemonic concept of Serbdom. Black Hand propaganda did not acknowledge the separate identity of Bosnian Muslims and flatly denied the existence of Croats. In order to prepare Serbdom for what would surely be a violent struggle for unity, the society would undertake revolutionary work in all territories inhabited by Serbs. Outside the borders of the Serbian state, the society would also combat by all means available the enemies of the Serbian idea. In their work for the national cause, these men increasingly saw themselves as enemies of the democratic parliamentary system in Serbia, and especially of the Radical Party, whose leaders they denounced as traitors to the nation. Within Udenezhny ili Smrt, the old hatred of the Serbian military for the Radical Party lived on. There were also affinities with the proto-fascist ideology. The objective was not merely a change in the sovereign personnel of the state. That had been achieved in 1903 without any appreciable benefits for the Serbian nation, but rather a thoroughgoing renovation of Serbian politics and society, a regeneration of our degenerate race. The movement thrived on a cult of secrecy. The members were inducted by a means of ceremony devised by Janovic Chupa, a member of the founding castle and a Freemason. New recruits swore an oath before a hooded figure in a darkened room pledging absolute obedience to the organization on pain of death. I, name, in joining the organization, union or death, swear by the sun that warms me, by the earth that nourishes me before God, by the blood of my ancestors, on my honor and on my life, that I will, from this moment, until my death, be faithful to the laws of this organization, that I will always be ready to make any sacrifice for it. I swear before God, on my honor and on my life, that I will execute all missions and commands without question. I swear before God, on my honor and on my life, that I will take all the secrets of this organization into my grave with me. May God and my comrades in the organization be my judges if, knowingly or not, I should ever violate this oath. Little was kept in the way of records. There was no central register of members, but a loose network of cells, none of which possessed an overview of the organization's extent or activities. As a result, uncertainty remains about the size of the organization. By the end of 1911, the number of members had risen to around 2,000, 2,500. It grew dramatically during the Balkan Wars, but a retrospective estimate deriving from a defector-turned informant of 100,000 to 150,000 is certainly inflated. Whatever the precise numbers, the Black Hand spread quickly into the structures of official Serbia, reaching out from their base within the military to infiltrate the cadre of Serbian border guards and custom officers, especially along the Serbian-Bosnia frontier. There were also numerous recruits among the espionage agents still working in Bosnia for the Narodna Odbrana, despite the ostensible shutdown of 1909. Among their activities was the maintenance of a terrorist training camp at which recruits were instructed in marksmanship, bomb-throwing, bridge-blowing, and espionage. Here was a setup made to measure for the seasoned conspirator Appy. The cult of secrecy suited his temperament. So did the organization's official insignia, a circular logo bearing a skull, crossbones, a knife, and a phial of poison and a bomb. Asked later why he and his colleagues had adopted these symbols, Appy replied that, for him, these emblems did not have such a frightening or negative look. After all, it was the task of all nationally minded Serbs to save Serbdom with bombs, knives, and rifles. In my work in Macedonia, he recalled, poison was used, and all guerrillas carried it both as a means of attack and to save someone if he fell into enemy hands. That is why such emblems entered the organization's seal, and it was a sign that these people were prepared to die. There was a paradoxically public quality to the clandestinity of the Black Hand. Loose talk soon ensured that the government and the press were aware of the movement's existence, and there is even some evidence that Prince Alexander, successor to the throne after the abdication of older brother Georgi, was informed in advance of the new foundation and was supportive of its activities. The prince was one of a small circle of sponsors who helped to finance the foundation of Piedmont. Recruitment processes were informal and often semi-public. Recruiters had merely to mention the patriotic work of the organization, and many officers joined without further ado. There were dinners and banquets in the Belgrade cafes, where Appy would reside over a long table thronged with nationalist students. When the commandant of Belgrade, Milos Bozanovic, asked his subordinate, Major Kostic, for information about the Black Hand, Kostic was incredulous. "Don't you know? It's his public knowledge. They are all talking about it in the cafes and public houses." Perhaps all this was inevitable in a city like Belgrade, where everyone knew everyone and where social life took place in coffeehouses rather than in private homes. But the spectacular secrecy of the Black Hand presumably also filled an emotional need. For what was the point of belonging to a secret organization if nobody knew what you did? To be seen wining and dining with other conspirators at the regular table conferred a sense of importance. It also created a thrilling sense of collusion amongst those who were formerly outside the network, but in the know, and this was important for a movement that claimed to represent the silent majority of the Serbian nation. But if its existence was a matter of general knowledge, there was plenty of room for uncertainty about its aims. Like many Radical Party leaders, Pasic viewed the Black Hand as a movement primarily dedicated to the overthrow of the Serbian state from within. He appears to have seen its ultra-nationalism as mere camouflage